Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 YOCAM Ecumenical Panel. In 2019, we were fortunate enough to host an on-campus discussion on the possibility of restoring Eucharistic intercommunion among Christians. This year, we enjoyed the convenience of assembling on Zoom to host another discussion among Christian experts on the crisis of the abuse of power and Christian reconciliation. Today, we seem to be in the midst of a perfect storm. 1 year ago, Christians confronted the usual problems: new allegations of sex abuse in the church, reports of power abuse committed by leaders of religious organizations and civil servants, and concern for the growing gap between the marginalized and the powerful. 2020 has introduced several problems, both old and new. No one has escaped the wrath and reach of COVID-19, a pestilence that shuts down governments, closes businesses, and creates discord in society. As summer approached, the shocking public killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis led to relentless demands for justice. Tensions heightened quickly in multiple cities as peaceful protesters and rioters marched through the streets. Violence erupted, property was damaged, and the fabric of society was torn. As summer gave way to fall, America faced perhaps the most contentious presidential election in its history. The polarization between parties and among peoples widened, evoking Alexander Solzhenitsyn's famous statement that the line separating good and evil passes through every human heart. Civil authorities promise us that the end of the pandemic is coming. A vaccine approaches. However, it is clear that citizens do not trust civil authorities, as a September poll from the Pew Research Center indicates that only 51% of adults are willing to get the vaccine, with 49% leaning against it at best. Problems also continue to afflict Christian communities. Some church leaders question the precautions taken to prevent the spread of COVID-19 during church services and protest wearing masks and changing liturgical practices. There is much anxiety in general about the stability of church life and the likelihood that people will resume regular participation when the pandemic does begin to ease. We should note that the crisis of authority is not limited to America. This country is not the only one enduring an agonizing path to electing a president. The current confrontation between protesters and President Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus, he was once called the last dictator in Europe, stems from accusations of election fraud and chilling reports of torture, kidnapping, and instances of police brutality. Many factors contribute to distrust, and one of them is the egregious abuse of power. What leads to abuse of power that inflicts harm upon others? What kinds of changes can be introduced to end the vicious cycle of using power to exploit people? Is there any hope for inaugurating reconciliation and building an era of trust? Tonight, we will begin to explore these questions in a Christian context and apply these principles to civil society. It is an honor to have 3 experts among us. Each panelist will speak for 10 minutes, and when they have all finished, we will have a short period of time devoted to moderated discussion. Only the panelists who are speaking should have unmuted microphones. So from this point forward until the end of the session, please mute your microphone and keep your camera off. If you have a question that you would like to pose to a panelist, you may put it in the chat, and hopefully there will be a few minutes at the end to take some of your questions. So from this point forward, except for the panelists, everyone should have their microphones muted and their cameras off. And now it's time to begin our discussion. Let me begin by introducing all three of our panelists for this evening, and then they will speak one by one. It is my pleasure to introduce the Reverend Dr. Christine Sunokoro, who did her PhD at Emory University. She is Associate Professor of Theology at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. She is a Latvian-American diasporic theologian working at the intersection of post-colonialism, liturgical and sacramental studies, as well as migration and diaspora discourses. At Xavier, she teaches in fields of modern historical theology, theology of migration, liturgical sacramental studies, pastoral theology, as well as diversity studies. She is the author of In Counterpoint, Diaspora, Postcoloniality, and Sacramental Theology, published by Pickwick in 2017, as well as numerous articles and book chapters on sacramentality and liturgy, constructive postcolonial theology, diasporic imagination, theological aesthetics, and theology of migration. We also have among us Dr. Adam DeVille, who is Associate Professor and Director of the Division of Humanities at the University of St. Francis in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Author in 2019 of Everything Hidden Shall Be Revealed, Ridding the Church of Abuses of Sex and Power, he has a book coming out in January 2021 on married Catholic priests, and another on post-war conflicts between Ukrainian and Russian Christians. He is currently at work on a book tentatively titled Theology After Freud. And we also welcome Dr. Ashley Purpura, who is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies at Purdue University. She holds a PhD from Fordham University and an MTS from Harvard Divinity School. Dr. Purpura researches the history of Orthodox Christian thought and investigates how historical religious practices and intellectual traditions shape power structures and identities within past and present religious communities. Her first book, God, Hierarchy, and Power, Orthodox Theologies of Authority from Byzantium, published by Fordham University Press in 2018, offers a rethinking of the development and maintenance of hierarchy as a theological concept. Currently, Dr. Purpura is the recipient of Fordham University's 2020 to 2021 NEH Faculty Fellowship in Orthodox Christian Studies, and she is preparing her second book monograph tentatively titled Sanctifying the Patriarchal Woman, Misrepresenting Gender Equality in Orthodox Christian Tradition. Welcome to our panelists, and our first speaker for this evening is Dr. Sunokoro. The title of her talk is Reflections on Worship, Confession of Sins, and the Sinned Against.
Thank you, Dr. Denisenko. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for this invitation, and I'm really delighted to be here with my colleagues on the very, very interesting panel. I have been interested in exploring the connections between the notions of sin as they are expressed in liturgies of confession and absolution on the one hand, and on the other hand, on how these liturgies relate to shape, accept, and alienate those who recognize themselves as sinners, but also those whose existential experiences are more of having been sinned against. In my explorations, I primarily engaged in my own tradition of Lutheranism in its various shapes and cultural contexts, and there are quite a few. But as someone who is a frequent guest in other Christian liturgical communities, of course, my observations are not limited to some strands of Lutheran tradition alone. My interest in the theological, liturgical, and also pastoral issues surrounding sin, especially in the perspectives of those who have been sinned against, socially, racially, sexually, economically, culturally, politically, and so on, was particularly ignited a few years ago by the pastoral experience that a colleague of mine, also a Lutheran pastor, shared in the context of her ministry here in the greater Cincinnati area some years ago. The experience she shared was from her ministry among undocumented Latina immigrants who had been sexually assaulted and raped as they were trying to seek asylum in the United States, coming from Central America. For the absolute majority of women asylum seekers, the trip to even reach the US-Mexico border is extraordinarily dangerous and involves sexual assault and rape. Little statistics is available officially about how many women are affected. Some official data show approximately 40 to 50%. But if you ask social workers and also pastors who actually work with immigrant women, they talk about the ballpark figure of more like 80 to 90%. So the perpetrators can be human traffickers, the so-called coyotes. It could be corrupt police and border patrol officers. It could be gang members. It could be detention center employees, and sometimes even fellow asylum seekers and locals in Mexico as these folks cross Mexico to even get to the border. So these women whom my colleague was talking about were not in any sense exceptional in the sense of having suffered this horrendous type of trauma. And yet they found it extremely difficult to participate in church worship services, especially the confession, precisely because they were asked to confess their sins, and all they could confess as the heaviest burdens on their conscience was that they were victims and survivors of abuse. They felt polluted and hence condemned in the sight of God. Confession offered an even heavier burden of guilt and shame rather than liberation and healing and forgiveness. They felt guiltier and guiltier in the context of the conventional liturgical language of sin precisely because it offered only the recognition and solution for someone's experience of having committed sins, but no language to seek forgiveness and healing for those who were actually sinned against to a much higher degree than they had done harm to other human persons. So this situation led these immigrant women to stop attending their traditional worship. They felt the confession liturgies were actually re-traumatizing them. And this is how they ended up eventually after a while at a Lutheran church where the pastoral care that my colleague offered was able to allow these women slowly and very gradually to move toward healing and also participation in worship again. Now, let me be clear, it wasn't the case that somehow the Lutheran confessional language would offer a magic formula for the healing and reconciliation with God. It wasn't the case. It all started with emergency pastoral care for immigrant women who were in dire need of support for constant anxiety due to deportation threats and fear to even leave their homes to take their kids to school or to do grocery shopping. It didn't begin with worship. It didn't begin with a church experience per se. It didn't begin with this ecclesiology or that ecclesiology, or this rite or that rite. It all began with the ministry of service and justice. Liturgy came later. And nevertheless, this experience prompted me to look at the rites of confession in my own Latvian Lutheran tradition, as well as in the traditions of Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Sin talk, of course, is not a popular and very cozy discourse today. So most people, as my students tell me all the time, even in our faith communities, avoid it at all costs if possible. Yet as long as our liturgies include confession and absolution based on our traditional notions of sin and sins, it is worth looking into how these traditional rites and the whole liturgical imagery of sin impacts those who are the sinned against. I find that this issue is not addressed as widely as I think it needs to be, not only in Lutheran context, but also in many other ecclesial contexts. In many churches, there are generic formulas that assume not just the fact that we are all sharing in the theological condition traditionally described as sin in singular, or original sin or ancestral sin, but also that we have committed sins in plural, actual sinful deeds for which we repent and ask God's forgiveness. And the issue here is this. In communal worship, the words are the same, that an abusive spouse will say standing or kneeling next to the spouse who was abused the previous night. The words are the same, that a person who has acted in racist or sexist ways just a day prior will say maybe a couple of pews away from those who were called N-word or B-word or F-word maybe just a few hours ago. In churches that have grievously suffered from the scandalous abuse of children by clergy and lay leadership, it may be a situation where the person who was sinned against in this perverse way is saying the words of confession only to receive absolution from the very person who sinned against them in the first place. So the questions that I believe are important to address liturgically, theologically, and pastorally in relation to the rites and words of confession and absolution are twofold. First, it seems to me that the very notion of sin is in need of a profound theological revamp. The concept increasingly appears vacuous and meaningless to a large segment of contemporary people, at least in its conventional formulations. That, of course, is a topic of a much longer and larger conversation than would be possible tonight. But definitely it needs to happen in dialogue with not only theological traditions, but also evolutionary biology, neuroscience, psychology, trauma studies, and anthropology, to name just a few major players in that conversation. But this conversation, I think, is long overdue. Secondly, the questions about ritual language and worship practices that I have explored in my article, Confession of Sin and the Sinned Against, an inquiry from a Lutheran perspective in the journal Liturgy, have a socio-ethical urgency precisely in conversation with the groundbreaking work of the Methodist Korean American theologian Andrew Sung Park on the relation between those sinned against and what salvation itself even means in that context and for them, and what a genuine repentance even means for them vis-a-vis their perpetrators, individual and also systemic. The Christian traditions have excellent theological, liturgical, and pastoral resources for the perpetrators of sins, and I'm talking about sins in plural. Yet, what is there for those who are sinned against, who are being sinned against, who have been sinned against? This question relates directly to the feminist critiques of liturgy and the lack of space in conventional liturgies for a whole spectrum of women's experiences. And I would recommend the work of Professor Ruth Duck, who has done wonderful, wonderful work in this area, and many other feminist liturgical theologians. But especially in the present moment of reckoning with racism in our country and in our communities of faith, I think it is absolutely important to engage the critique of the privatized mainstream notions of sin and confession that, for example, Theodore Jennings Jr. has voiced by calling for a substantial reconstruction of the doctrine of sin beyond the juicy, individualized, and hypersexualized imageries of sin toward more realistic and also more systemic and social conceptions of sin. In short, it seems to me that the sin talk is very relevant and urgent in our communities of faith. But there's also a need for a new kind of sin talk. There's a need for a new way of identifying, repenting, and confessing of sin. While the old formulas might still work quite wonderfully for some, the old theological and liturgical formulas are, at the same time, it seems, increasingly losing practical traction for growing segments of our society. As we know, most church memberships are not growing. In most cases, the relevant question is how quickly are they shrinking, especially among younger generations? And so my question for consideration tonight is that maybe the traditional way of thinking and talking about sin and confessing it in our worship practices, in our worship services, has something to do, among other things, of course, with these ecclesial trends that are trending downward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And now we will go to our second presenter for the evening. Dr. DeVille is the next panelist, and the title of his talk is Who Says Obedience is a Virtue and Disobedience a Vice? toward a psychoanalysis of claims to power and the desires to submit. Dr. DeVille, welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. I'm struck, just by way of introduction, with what was just said, and some of the discussion about confession and sin and sinful structures. You know, when I was first getting into theology in the late 1990s, that was the topic that kind of hooked me, was the role of sinful structures in the thought of Pope John Paul II. Fast forward to my recent work, including what we're going to talk about tonight, and I never thought 20 odd years ago that we might have to use the categories of sinful structures to talk about the church and the churches themselves. It seemed, at least in the analysis of the mid to late 90s, that this was something we could usefully apply to the world, but we were somehow exempt from. And I think one of the things I realized over the last 2 years, especially as I was writing my most recent book, was that we have really been engaged in some collective ecclesial self-delusion if we think that the very structures of churches are not themselves both implicated in sin and even, you know, to use some old Catholic language, occasions of sin or near occasions of sin. And perhaps in some of our discussion later on, we'll come back to that. But the issues of power, obedience, and disobedience. This was another area where my own thinking has changed a lot in the last couple of years since writing the book on the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. You know, when I entered the Catholic Church, also in the 1990s, you know, I read and even wrote about the virtue of obedience in the thought of people like John Henry Newman, for example, and then also in the work of Henri de Lubac, one of the great Jesuit theologians of the 20th century, and, you know, defending the idea that obedience to the church was a great thing, and that we all needed to recover that in an age when obedience seemed to be, you know, increasingly irrelevant to the world at large. And I look back 20 odd years on that now, and I think I wouldn't say those things now, and I wouldn't defend those positions now. In fact, I think we need to have a serious discussion about whether obedience is a virtue and disobedience a vice. And just to sort of lay my cards completely on the table here, I'm coming more and more to the conclusion that certainly within the Christian tradition, theologically, disobedience remains almost completely under-theorized, if we can put it that way, under-theologized, and very much needs to be looked at in a serious way. I haven't done exhaustive research on this, but, you know, surveying databases of theological literature in the 20th century, there's very little that's been done. And the only times it does seem to come out is in discussions around, for example, in this country, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, thanks to the influence of people like, you know, Dr. Martin Luther King, occasionally a little bit in some of the protests against nuclear war in the 1970s and 80s. But otherwise, it again remains helpfully, or rather unhelpfully, externalized. You know, disobedience is something that we might occasionally, as Christians, think of using to protest the powers and abuses of the state, but never something that we might think of as a necessary practice for Christians to cultivate within the Christian community. And that goes hand in hand with the kind of the much more developed tradition in which obedience is held up and theologized quite extensively. You know, in preparing for this last night, I was going back, looking through some of the documents of the Second Vatican Council, and the great charter on the Church, Lumen Gentium of Vatican II. You know, it uses the word obedience and its cognates almost 24 times. And in fact, the whole document is kind of interestingly framed. There's a sort of a Christological framing of obedience at the outset, and then there's a Mariological framing of obedience towards the end. And in between those two bookends, there are extensive exhortations to Catholics, you know, to be obeying the hierarchs of the church as their shepherds, and, you know, and even more concrete exhortations, you know, consecrated religious to obey their superiors, parishioners to obey their parish priests, priests to obey their bishops, and bishops to obey the Pope. And it's never clear. It comes right up to the line and very strongly hints that the reason you do that is because there's almost, not quite, but there's almost an identification between that obedience to human figures in the church and obedience to God. It never quite goes so far as to make that explicit, but it's really strongly hinted. And that, I think, is something we need to look at. I think that, I mean, I'm glad it didn't go that far and cross the line and say, well, you know, obeying a bishop or obeying a priest is ipso facto obeying Christ. Because I don't think we could get away with that kind of blanket statement, but it really wants to go in that direction and comes very close to going in that direction. And part of what I have come to realize in the last couple of years is that we need to really seriously examine that and be much more explicit about the limitations on that and the conditions under which it may or may not be appropriate to offer such obedience. It's tempting, you know, if you read the literature on the abuse crisis, as I did for the book I published last year, the horrors that are recounted there and the massive trauma that's inflicted on you know, boys and girls, men and women, it makes one, it certainly makes me anyway, very tempted to sort of say, you know, we just really should think about abolishing claims and practices of obedience in the church. And, you know, interesting for me anyway, the person who's held me back from that leap, as it were, is not Catholic or Christian. It's the Jewish psychoanalyst and critic Erich Fromm. And Erich Fromm is really interesting because he's written on these topics, I think, in more compelling ways than a lot of others. This year actually is the 40th anniversary of Fromm's death, and so I've written a couple of essays to sort of renew some attention to him. And these themes actually begin and end his life. His breakout book in 1941 is on the problem of freedom and obedience. And his very last book, which was actually published just after he died it was published in 81, he died in 80, is on disobedience. And Fromm is the one that points out that if you go towards the total abolition of obedience in any way, then what you run the real risk of is what he calls narcissistic tyranny. And I think, you know, forgive me for intruding this note here, we in this country are getting a taste of that in federal politics. And I think we can appreciate perhaps more than we ever could the real dangers of people who willingly submit to the demands of others and don't question whether they should be doing that, for example. And so I think the time is ripe. I think the time is more than ripe for Christians to say we have to be much clearer, much more explicit about the circumstances under which we ask for and expect and offer obedience. And we have to stop sort of denigrating disobedience and start seeing it as an important and necessary thing. Just one final thing I'll mention here, and that is the other person I found very helpful here also happens to be a psychoanalyst, but this one's a Jesuit priest as well, Carlos Domínguez Morano in Spain. And he makes a really interesting point that if you talk about, for example, the classic vows of monastic life in the Christian tradition, poverty, chastity, and obedience, he said you can find plenty of scriptural support for poverty and chastity. But obedience is really almost non-existent in Scripture anyway. And in fact, you know, you can make a case, as he does, that there's actually significant material in Scripture in praise of disobedience, but conveniently the tradition has largely ignored that. You know, if you look in a lot of the big biblical commentaries, for example, under disobedience, sometimes it's not there at all, or sometimes it's got a very brief paragraph that doesn't say very much. And I take from that, again, to my larger point, that this is an area we need to begin to think about more comprehensively and internally now, not just as something we occasionally do to protest, nuclear war or some some horror coming out of the White House this week, but something that churches and Christian communities need to be looking at in terms of their own internal life and practice.
All right, thank you, Dr. DeVille. It looked like you had finished, so.
Yep.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. We've taken copious notes on your comments, so I think we will circle back to some of those when we get to the moderated discussion. At this point, I would like to invite Dr. Purpura to deliver her presentation, and the title of her talk is Communicating Divine Power and the Practice of Hierarchy.
Thank you, Deacon Nick. In my remarks tonight, I'm going to focus on theology and examples primarily from the Eastern Orthodox Christian traditions, which are primarily hierarchical and patriarchically structured. But of course, I hope that this speaks to other Christian denominations and even secular and other religious contexts. So abuse of power is nothing new. For centuries, theologians, fellow clerics, monastics, and even lay people have had to navigate their spiritual and ecclesiastical identities when those in ostensible positions of church power did not live up to the divine ideals associated with their offices. There have been heretical bishops, lustful and drunk priests, imperial co-opting of the church for political gain. It's a wonder that people remained in the church at all, especially within such a hierarchical system, and perpetuated it. But they did. And not because they were somehow duped into obedience, but in many instances because they understood power within the church to come from God. When it did not reflect God, various theologians found theological ways to withdraw their authority from that individual and yet maintain the goodness and power of the church. So perhaps to our previous speaker's point, there is some tradition of sainted theologians within at least the Greek-speaking East, of subverting whatever the authority might be, and then kind of in hindsight, Maximus the Confessor is a great example of this, being canonized as a saint, even though during his own lifetime, there was a lot of conflict with those in authority, even within the church. Simeon, the new theologian, of course, is another example of this. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is provide us with a way to think about a theology of power within the church that might shift our perspective in perhaps a very idealistic way. And I acknowledge that, but I think that it still helps us then apply and navigate that ideal in ways that is kind of always in conversation with kind of the reality, the broken, fractured, sinful reality in which we live, and perhaps a theological ideal that we are always trying to participate in. So this first theological claim is that God is the source of all power. And then hierarchy is the divinely given means by which that power is communicated through the church. And of course, there's all sorts of wonderful historical analysis that we could do here to show why that's the case, drawing on Platonism, but we'll skip through that for the sake of brevity tonight and just kind of give you the constructive points for how we might take kind of a shifted perspective to navigate abuses of power within the church. God's power, what does it look like? We say God is the source of power. God's power is fundamentally kenotic. And that is, we know God's power as Christians, specifically through his self-emptying, self-sacrifice, and self-giving love. Divine power is one, especially in the Orthodox tradition, of paradoxical lowliness, right? By which God empties himself to empower or divinize those below him. This is the model that is revealed and established in Christ for the priesthood and the participation of the church more broadly. The hierarchy then functions to communicate divinity, to pass along divine power, to divinize its participants, to use those above, so we could think of like our spiritual elders, our saints, our bishops maybe, to then raise up those spiritually below, if we think of kind of a hierarchy, and to draw a divinely created diversity into a divine unity. Hierarchy then should be using a divinely appointed position, whether it's in a recognized ministerial office, priesthood, deacon, or administration of the sacraments, or particular calling of the laity to manifest Christ in our midst and bring and be God to others. If we admit that God is the source of power, then those who actually mediate power within the church should manifest Christ-likeness, should being the operative word. Holiness is recognized not just through one's office, but through humility and love. The office of priests and their actions sacramentally in the context of liturgy will necessarily communicate God to others through the sacraments, through the Eucharist. This does not depend on the holiness of the priest in particular. But for their actions outside of the liturgical context, for their authority in this broader pastoral ministry, they must offer themselves as an icon of God. Otherwise, their authority is limited, and it should be limited. We as laity should recognize that limitation. Authority is the recognition of divine likeness and the presence of divinity in others, and then voluntarily submitting to them for spiritual benefit. If only God is powerful, then priests, bishops, and spiritual leaders have authority to act on God's behalf only to the extent that they manifest his likeness and communicate his divinity to others. And this is, again, not in a type of power and I'm going to be, in charge and bring everyone to do a certain thing. This is through a position of servitude, a humility, and self-offering as a model for leadership. When this divine likeness is distorted through our human failings, or the truth of God's condescension is misrepresented, then as participants in the body of Christ, Christians are not bound to this authority. Perhaps this is a model for holy disobedience, because this is not actually the hierarchy and this person is no longer acting in the image of God, and they're not communicating divine likeness. This is not an invitation to avoid any type of spiritual obedience, but rather a recognition that spiritual obedience and submission must always be voluntary. This is part of our Christological imitation, right? You have to fully and freely put yourself in obedience to someone else. And at every moment can interrogate that relationship. It's not some sort of once and for all. Although there's certainly examples in the tradition that are very troubling on that point. There is something to note. Everyone needs to recognize our perception of divine likeness must be sought in humility, to acknowledge both that those in positions of power may not be the ones God has actually empowered because they have rejected his presence and calling. And at the same time, within the church, there may be those in whom God dwells in unexpected ways, maybe who aren't ordained. I think of some of the kind of old church ladies in parishes that I've attended that offered more spiritual guidance perhaps than the bishop, but no one, the priest, the clerics wouldn't acknowledge this type of authority. We as laity and church participants must not try to limit God to our expectations, but through divine participation, prayerfully recognize this kind of like by like as participants in the Spirit. Lastly, to acknowledge amid our human failings within the church that God is still present, no matter how broken our systems and our priesthood and those who fulfill those offices might be, that God, the Holy Spirit, still dwells in the church. And that it may be spiritually beneficial to voluntarily humble ourselves at times to others, especially when it's perhaps not an abusive situation, but we just recognize certain shortcomings in those who are ministering to ourselves. Perhaps the most Christ-like thing to do would be to ignore that and to humble yourself in that relationship. And the key here is to not let the icon of Christ within us or in others be abused through mistreatment. We can always think, how might our actions within the church in relation to those surrounding us communicate God, communicate divinity? In the last few minutes, I'd just like to think about how this shifting perspective of God fundamentally being the source of power and the hierarchy, those who have power within the church just being ministers of that power, and that power should look Christ-like at all times to have any authority, how this perspective might shift and some of the issues that are presently addressing different traditions and congregations. So if we think of hierarchy as being constituted by the communication of divinity, when we name hierarchy, the boundaries of the church should be undertaken with more humility and trepidation. I would even say a type of apophatic openness. Hierarchy or church power is often used to speak for and name who is in and who is out, whether it's schisms, territory quibbles, who is the sinner and who is holy. And this is done in ways that can do serious spiritual damage to whole populations. We can think, for instance, in the Orthodox traditions of the treatment of the LGBTQ community and individuals, right? Or constrain ecumenical and interfaith relations in ways that really is just needless. If we prioritize understanding the power of the church as Christ's power, then how do any of these boundaries and exclusions reflect God's love that is best known through the incarnation? Perhaps a better approach would be to humbly encounter others, invite them into relationships without a certain expectation or sense of entitlement towards obedience, and offer them a witness of divine love. If we acknowledge that our perception of the hierarchy is limited, that there may be those who act as bishops, and there may be those in the church without recognition who may be hierarchically higher up, then this would be humbling to our actual ordained hierarchs in their positions, right? They should kind of hold their position with trepidation, not with a sense of I've earned this, or this is a status, right? We see a lot, perhaps self-servingness in some of these ministries. This might also help us reinvigorate the participation of the laity, right, in the various ministries and gifts that they can offer. Hierarchy of the church is often mistaken as a way to have power over the church. Those within the hierarchical offices often mistake their power as their own rather than Christ's, and it should be self-giving and emptying on behalf of the others. If we shift this perspective, right, that this is not their power, but the power is only in service and empowering others, perhaps the most disenfranchised, the lowliest of the church, of society, right? And these are the ones that should be sought out to serve. This could be very beneficial, I think. In many churches, there's this type of rampant clericalism that alienates laity, has very little impact in terms of spiritual authority, and yet these individuals are empowered with all sorts of responsibilities as the public face of the church. If we think about the power of the hierarchy as God's power administered through this kenotic service that should be manifest at every level of the church, rather than a clerical elite set apart from those below, this would hopefully help heal that type of chasm. Lastly, the abuse of positions of power in the church in the most hurtful ways, right? The offense of the person, the harm of the innocent of another, by one whose office, by virtue of their office, of their ministry, should communicate the likeness of God. If one thinks of this likeness and God's power primarily as loving condescension to elevate the other, rather than someone who demands obedience or abuses another, then it's clear in this abusive action, the priest or the cleric does not have any divine authority and is in no real position of power. It's not a priest, right? We can think of instances, all sorts of great patristic quotes about this person not actually being a priest because they're no longer fulfilling the divine logos of priesthood. He does not represent God and is abusing his position in the worst way possible by misrepresenting and disfiguring what should be an icon of God. For those hurt or marginalized by the church, these actions were not from God or on God's behalf, right? Nevertheless, we cannot control others' behaviors, but can be sanctified in our own responses to them, right? And so we always have to think a little bit about how can respecting the image of God within ourselves, and then how can we help manifest this image to other people, not just as priests, but as laity, as mothers, all sorts of different individuals as participants within the church. So in closing, let me just say that Christians do offer the world in a crisis of power surprisingly subversive attitude. We should reject the authority of those who abuse their position in or outside of the church, who do not serve in improving the positions of others, but only who serve to improve their own positions. God ultimately has power and models for us what that power should be in the world, which ultimately is a display of love for the other. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all three panelists for your remarks. And at this point, I'm going to begin a moderated discussion. And I'll ask one question of each panelist. And if those of you who are on the Zoom call have questions that you would like to pose, hopefully we can have a few minutes at the end to take a couple of your questions. Please feel free to put them in the chat. I'd like to begin with you, Dr. Sunakoro. Thank you very much for your remarks. And I want to be honest, I was inspired by we both published a paper in that edition of Liturgy that you mentioned. And I was so inspired by your essay that I assigned it to my students in the class that I was teaching on liturgical theology immediately. And it raises so many issues. But really, I think the big issue that strikes me here is you've illuminated this sense of we need to pay attention to the sinned against. So much of the ritual tradition, you mentioned that there are pastoral resources, ritual resources that are oriented towards the perpetrator, but not so much about the sinned against. And the question that I'd like to ask is, what can the people of the liturgical assembly do to contribute to making the sinned against whole again? And just to mention, I think it's important to remind your opening words about what inspired you in the first place, the undocumented Latina immigrants who couldn't go to church because they were finding the ritual itself to add more trauma. It seems that we need some kind of a transformation of the way that we do things ritually. What are your thoughts and reflections? What can the people who are in the assembly do to really create an environment of healing for those who are sinned against?
Thank you for the question. This is obviously it's a very, very multifaceted question. So I will try to be as brief as possible. I just wanted to mention that it seems like the editor of that volume of Liturgy, where both our essays were published, Bruce Morrill, might be among us. I'm seeing a Zoom window, so if so, then definitely I would like to thank Professor Morrill for inviting this really rich array of essays for that particular volume, and it seems like it's really struck the chord. So a couple of thoughts here. First of all, I think the most important posture or comportment, if you will, would be the posture, the attitude of listening. It seems like the experiences of those who are sinned against, and again, there's a whole a slew of experiences of having been sinned against. And since we are talking about very explicitly sexism and racism and a lot of things that are systemic, the question, I think, is how do our communities of worship make space to hear the voices of those who have been in this sinned against position, and not just because of some personal occurrence in life, but because of these systemic structural settings that permeate our society. And of course, Dr. DeBille was talking about those already in terms of structures. The church is obviously not immune from sinful structures, and I think that has to be made more explicit. So in the communities, I think the first step would be listening. The second step would be, again, a very honest self-examination. I remember the observation that I think still rings true. The great Jesuit liturgical theologian Joseph Jungmann wrote that for many, many people in the past, but also in the present, I believe, liturgy is indeed the most important form of pastoral care. Not every lay person has a spiritual director, even though many do these days. Not everybody is doing therapy, which is a replacement for quite a few things that formerly in the past was accomplished in liturgical and devotional settings. So there are still a lot of people for whom liturgical worship is the primary care, a primary type of pastoral care. And I think if there is a need for deeper healing, for deeper reconciliation, it cannot happen if the metanoia or the repentance process is superficial, or if it is assumed to be generic, because one size does not fit all. And I think the exodus of younger people from our churches, and that goes across denominations, is somewhat at least related to the fact that worship is no longer perceived as meaningful. It does not fulfill the deepest longings and yearnings of a lot of people in our society. And so, to put it kind of very simply, it doesn't scratch where it itched. And so that might be one of the reasons why people are not interested in coming and participating. And so I would say that it is definitely a complex of actions and attitudes. At the core of it all, I think, is the metanoia of mind and heart. And that would involve a recognition that there are so many people who have experienced trauma, and to ignore that, and to continue using language, gestures, postures that are deeply re-traumatizing. And it's not just women who have suffered abuse and so forth from patriarchal structures as such, but also people in various categories, to ignore that it takes more than just saying, well, you try to interpret the old language and the old formulas, the old rubrics in a way that makes meaning to you. I think that's no longer sufficient. And of course, this is a huge question, but just a couple of thoughts on this.
Thank you so much. Just to put out there, one of the things that strikes me about the tradition that I come from, the Eastern Orthodox tradition, is that we have so much emphasis on a confession of faith. Sometimes we even sing it with gusto during the course of our Eucharistic liturgies, but the sibling of the confession of faith, a communal renunciation of sin that occurs at baptism, is completely absent. Because we, outside of a general confession and private prayers of penance, I think that there could be some group thinking, some ecumenical group thinking that could do some good and begin to build bridges, since a number of these issues are affecting all of our communities, regardless of our confessional identities and loyalties. And now I'd like to turn to Dr. DeVille. I read your book last year on the sex abuse scandal. It's a very powerful and a bold book, and you speak very directly in that book. And I've been thinking a lot, we have kind of an undercurrent theme here of a number of converging things coming together. Kenosis, lowliness, disobedience, a sort of an illumination, a common confession, an admission, a public admission of the things that have done wrong that all are complicit in. And in your book, and I'm trying to pull your book together with what you've spoken about in disobedience, one of the things that strikes me about the events of the last year is it's essentially kind of like a public call to look and to see the dignity of those who have been sinned against. And you cover this in your book. And you have many suggestions. Some are structural, others are canonical, and you also propose ending the prohibition on married priests in your book. What I'd like to ask you to comment on is, how could humanizing priests and bishops reconfigure this power balance between clergy and laity? Is disobedience one of the things that is necessary for humanizing priests and bishops? You're the expert, so what do you say?
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to see if I can pull together a couple things here, including a response to what was just said, which I think is very rich with a lot of overlap and potential. I think we need that kind of confession of sin and recognition of what has been done in the church. And I think if we don't have the places for that to happen, any efforts at humanizing clergy and changing structures and so on are going to be very blunted and very limited in their effect. So I think it's, one of the things I've been saying to my ecclesiology students this semester as we've been talking about this is it's not a one and done. Here's the solution, whatever that might be, and that's all we have to do. This has to be a multi-pronged effort that's going to outlast probably all of us, and be working in a number of directions simultaneously. So humanizing clergy, I think one of the ways we could do that very immediately would be for them to make ongoing recognition of what has been done. For example, if we had a public liturgical confession of sin, I don't think in the book, but I know elsewhere I've gone back to the example of what happened on the first Sunday of Lent in the Vatican Basilica in Rome in the year 2000, which the late Pope John Paul II wanted to keep as a special jubilee for the start of the Great Millennium. And there was a special liturgy devised for that day in which cardinals came up one by one and confessed various sins that had been committed by Christians over the years. Sins against women, sins of violence against Jewish and Muslim peoples, colonial conquest, and so on. And I think that's not something we should have just done once 20 years ago, but I think that there needs to be some thinking. You just opened the door to ecumenical collaboration on how we can maybe devise that as something Christians do annually. Ideally, or Lent seems to be the time to do that, but perhaps more than that, or perhaps times as well as Lent. So that kind of admission of wrongdoing, both by for example, clerical perpetrators themselves, but also their episcopal those in episcopacy who covered it up, I think would be a good place to start. Beyond that, I think we, some of the other things that we haven't looked at least in the Catholic world, to humanize people and get away from this sort of turning children and others into sexual objects for exploitation. I think in very practical terms. I think a lot of our communities are far too big. If you look at the size of the average Catholic diocese, for example, you're looking at tens and in some cases hundreds of thousands, and in some cases, Chicago, LA, New York, you're looking at millions of people. You can't have a relationship with the man who's supposed to be, the chief shepherd of the diocese when you're one among several million people. You can't even really have a significant relationship, I think, with the man who is supposed to be the spiritual father of a parish if that parish has got 6, 8, 10 masses on a Sunday, and there's several hundred people at each of those. So size, I think, of our communities is something we need to look at. The dynamics of power and how it is, or rather is not shared. And then you mentioned the one thing I put at the last chapter of the book, which is opening the door in the Catholic world to broader, at least presbyteral marriage, if not episcopal marriage. And I hem that in with a lot of caveats and qualifications, because that's far from being a major component. I don't want people to think that that's something that we should do and that's going to take care of the problem straight away, because of course there's lots of contrary evidence that you've got married football coaches and married Boy Scout pastors and so on that commit abuse. So that would be one thing, but I think we need to be thinking liturgically, we need to be thinking canonically, we need to be thinking in terms of numbers and structures, a number of things that we need to pursue to humanize, to reconcile, to confess fault, and just to begin the process of healing.
Thank you very much. It reminds me, last year at the North American Academy of Liturgy, there was a discussion on, you mentioned commemorations. There was a discussion on this, and there seemed to be a thrust, a common consensus that the time has arrived to simply compose new liturgical offices of lament and to write the poetry that would be a common lamenting, sort of like a folding in of a public confession, which you would think at least possibly could address this question of who is complicit, which is a question that Christine raised in her presentation about not so much individual but systemic and social orders. And on that note, this is a nice segue to turn to Ashley and to your presentation, because you went right to kenosis and you talked about the idealism, which I very much appreciate. And of course, as theology instructors, we teach about this. And you mentioned lowliness, the great paradox of lowliness. And I think there's an interesting link between yours and Adam's presentations here, where when we talk about people who have power and vulnerability, the difficulty that a traumatized person, whatever the case might be, to make themselves vulnerable to the person who has power is one that needs to be unpacked. Like, for example, you think about the situation that we're in. A friend has been saying, what would it be like to be assigned a pastor to a new congregation right now that had been really afflicted in so many ways by COVID-19? I can only imagine, you walk into a situation like that, and what do you say? And so, Ashley, I'd like to ask you to comment on this idealism. I mean, I think that most theologians would agree, yes, this kenosis, this divine power, it comes from God, and you demonstrate so beautifully in your book that if it's not kenotic in the ministry, then it is not of God, and you kind of closed with that. But what I'd like to ask it for you to comment on is it even possible for those who have been traumatized to make themselves vulnerable to those who have been ordained to ministry and who have the responsibility of carrying this office? And then maybe the three of you can comment on the vulnerability that goes the other way. Those who possess the power and making themselves vulnerable to a community of people and their experience, because it seems that also is underutilized. So let's turn to Ashley first, if you might want to comment on both of these ends of the spectrum here.
Sure. Thank you. It's such a rich question to think about. I'd say first that we have to remember that the relationship between our leaders of our church, our priesthood, for example, and the parish, let's say, is not one of transaction or entitlement, or even though a lot of it is ritually scripted, right? You're going to bow to the priest is going to bow to you, right? There's a lot kind of within our services where that relationship is scripted, but it is a human relationship. And so just as in families maybe that have suffered abuse, let's think of a woman who's been in an abusive relationship with a man, it's going to be hard then when she meets another man that maybe she wants to be vulnerable with, to not somehow imprint and see, oh, he's just like the other one, right? And so even the priesthood, as much as we can make distinctions between the priest and the sacrament, right, the office and the person, there's still iconographically is a kind of blending, right? An association that we cannot expect human beings, right? This is how they've come to know what a bishop or a priest is like. And if they have come to know that father figure, right, to be an abusive figure, or to be someone who's overly controlling or too nosy into their sexual life, or someone who doesn't protect them from COVID, it is going to be very difficult when they have a new priest, minister, deacon come into their parish for them to suddenly say, oh, he's different, he displays divine likeness, it's fine, right? This healing is going to take time. And so I think in some ways, the part of that display of Christ likeness is being open to the time and the healing and where that has to take place, because it may not happen in the church, right? This may be in the hands of mental health professionals. It may be someone taking time away from the parish until they feel that it's safe to return. And so I think part of that is kind of prayerfully awaiting someone's return, praying for their healing, but doing so in a way that respects their individuality, just as God respects our individuality and is not coercing us to come be in a relationship with him.
I'd like to invite, thank you very much. That is, I really appreciate what you said about the time, the space, the going outside of the community to find that space and those resources for healing. And a lot of this also seems to be dialogical, that you have to work these things out. I'd like to invite Christine and Adam also to comment on this sort of second part of this vulnerability. Christine, I see you're unmuted, so please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, as you heard, I represent one of the Lutheran sub-traditions, and I think that keeping context in mind is very important for us to really find the constructive solutions that are appropriate and fitting for each context. I would like to say that I represent a type of Lutheranism that is very congregational. It is an Episcopal structure. I have a regional bishop and then an archbishop, and I've served in multiple positions of hierarchy, church hierarchy, as an ordained minister myself. And I have to say that in my denominational context, of course, we have our own sins, but the structure is configured in such a way that the hierarchy is has been actively disempowered because of the ingrained deep anti-clericalism that is part of the Latvian culture due to all sorts of colonial overtones. There's no time to go into that historical element, but I would just like to say that the fact that the hierarchy itself is at this point about 50% female also might play a role, because the leadership style is different. And again, I don't want to simplify it. There are many factors playing a role here, but I think it's something to consider. So I would say, I remember that saying of Pope Francis, as a matter of fact. I don't remember what context he was speaking on, but he once commented like that power is like drinking gin on empty stomach. And I cannot disagree. I think he's really onto something. And for that reason, I would say that one of the trends that I would see as possibly constructive and fruitful would be to decentralize power as much as possible in the church, because there is obviously only one source of power, and I think we need more of an apophatic subversion of power in practices, relating to Ashley's point in her presentation, that would ensure that we learned from our own mistakes. And finally, regarding vulnerability, I think that vulnerability is a very, very sensitive and very tricky topic. It is a very tricky issue. And so I would say that it would be, from my perspective, unethical and unconscionable indeed to expect vulnerability from those who are positioned lower on the power rung, if you will. So I would say that vulnerability is something that can be offered as a gift of trust. It cannot be institutionalized except for those who are by structure positioned in spaces and relationships that unavoidably exert power. There, I think vulnerability has to be structurally inbuilt in the job description, if you will. But for all the others, to expect vulnerability, I think, is maybe something that I would be extremely, extremely cautious about, because that depends on so many different factors, and it carries such a potential for abuse that we have had already strings of examples from the past and maybe even from the present, that I would say I'm very careful about using that imagery at all, because I think it is explosively difficult to handle that in ecclesiastical contexts. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I think that having participated in any number of Orthodox theological conferences, once the Me Too, the hashtag Me Too movement and everything that came with it entered into the public discourse of academia, that we may be even witnessing the beginning of a paradigm shift in the Orthodox field on this whole question of vulnerability, because it seems to simply come with a ritual package that the laity will make themselves vulnerable to those who hold these offices. And it's a story, I guess, for another time, but I think your message resonates and echoes across confessional boundaries. And so I thank you for that. And I'd like to invite Adam to comment here as well, if you would like.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I'd just echo, the caution and the concern. I read an interesting book, came out late last year, Trauma and Lived Religion. It's an international collection, and there was a very harrowing essay in there about people making themselves vulnerable in confession and being re-traumatized. It was a case of a woman who had been sexually abused, and there was an attempt to sort of reconcile with the abuser in a Sunday liturgy. And the kinds of comments she was getting was, you like Christ should just keep silent in the face of, this person and say nothing. So that lots of bad ways to do that. But I think you've raised a good question of a challenge. Are there ways we can find that are good and healthy and that will build people up and restore life and healing if people come forward and do that? I want to go back to something Christine said earlier that I wrote down. I'm really struck by that. That liturgy is the place of pastoral care for most people. And I think, I was working on an essay this summer. I haven't got it finished, but I think we need to look at that more intentionally. I'm really struck by the threefold structure. Robert Taft talks about structural units in the liturgy. Well, the structural units in therapy with traumatized people, and a lot of the major works, Judith Herman and Bessel van der Kolk among them in trauma in the last 25 years have talked about this kind of threefold structure, or these three units you have to have. And the first is to be in a safe place. The second is to be heard, to be able to tell your story. And then the third is to be sent back to, live your life in a more integrated fashion. And I mean, it seems to me that's what we do liturgically. Really, in every tradition, there's a gathering. We tell the story. And if we think about it in these terms, we tell the story of trauma every week, right? We tell the story of a man who was innocent, but was nonetheless unjustly arrested and tortured and executed. But we don't end on that. We end, with the triumph of the resurrection. Can we, with all of that in mind, can we find ways in which to be more conscious about allowing liturgy to be a place where some of the more particular traumas that we've experienced can be told? I don't know how we do that, and I think it does require a lot of very careful thought. And it probably, I don't know that it could be done in some of the large-scale gatherings that, at least pre-pandemic, many churches were having. It might need to be done in smaller, house churches or particular groups within larger communities. But I think we need to find ways of doing that. And I think too, I think part of what I heard you asking, Nick, was, those in authority, can they themselves make themselves vulnerable in this process? And I think that has to be part of it as well. How we get bishops to stop thinking, in a Catholic context, I would say, how do we get them to stop thinking first of what the lawyers are going to say, and more of what's the right thing to do here? Because if you read the literature of the people abused, time and time again, they go to bishops, and bishops either say nothing or just try to get out of there as fast as they can with, as small a check as they can write to make it go away. And people want to hear something, they want to hear that they've been taken seriously, and if we can get bishops to start going back to doing that, being shepherds first and being CEOs with an office of legal counsel second, then we might have them be more vulnerable and open up some paths to healing.
Thank you very much. We're coming to the end of our time, and so I'm before we close, there is one more issue I want to raise, and I think like to hear from all three of you. Maybe we can try to keep it to 30 seconds, more than the 15 that the moderator of the most recent debate was giving to to the two debaters in 30 seconds. I think that what you just said, we want to be taken seriously. You could probably hashtag that right now. And that might be the refrain that goes across the entire world, from Armenia to Belarus and Minsk to Lebanon to the tumult that's afflicting the United States. And what I want to ask is, and then 30 seconds doesn't do it justice, but that's all the time that we have. Is there any way to take seriously in the context that we find ourselves in church and in the public sphere, without structural reform? Christine, why don't you lead us off?
Well, this must be very brief. I cannot quite see how a genuine change, a genuine transformation can happen without a structural change. Of course, the question is what type of structural change, how to initiate it, who takes the initiative, who leads, who follows. And I think those are very contextual questions. But I think the church history shows pretty clearly that when we emphasize only the pious interiority and change and transformation that happens in the interiority of our hearts and minds, it's obviously very important, but it is far from being the end of the story.
Thank you very much, Christine. Ashley?
I would say that it can certainly start with a person, right? Personal change by those in leadership can start to have an impact and attend to other persons as type this relationship. But structural change must be a part of it too, because one person cannot represent a whole only from their limited perspective. And so this is something now that I'm working on with kind of the patriarchal nature of the Orthodox Church. And especially when Adam, I know I'm almost at 30 seconds, when Adam was talking about developing rituals, right? Or liturgical language that gives expression to trauma. I'm thinking, well, who's going to write that, right? Who's able to be in the room that says, this is the prayer that speaks to my experience? So I think it can start with the personal, right? Setting aside our own egos in the ministry of others, and then it has to move towards structural reform.
Thank you, Ashley. Adam?
Yes, I think I agree. There has to be the structural reform there. But as Ashley has said, there has to be the personal transformation also. You can have wonderful systems in place, but as we all know, they're always going to be run by human beings. And you can have the systems safeguard against human weakness and temptation and abuses, but you can't, I think, totally put your faith in them. So there has to be the structural reform that goes along with the personal transformation. I would say in the Catholic context, I think the structural reform would have to take priority in some places. We've heard appeals for personal change for decades, and it hasn't contained the problem. And so I think we can't avoid looking at the structural questions now.
Thank you, and thank you to our three panelists who have addressed these issues for us this evening. As we all know, we're living in a crisis of a great magnitude with COVID-19, with the social tumult that seems to be resounding throughout the world, but there is always hope. And our panel of experts has given us hope that we can understand both the causes of this crisis and work together to offer healing to those who are the most afflicted. So to Dr. Sunukuro, to Dr. Purpura, and Dr. DeVille, thank you for being with us tonight. I want to conclude by sharing an observation I learned from my days as a liturgical student. Fall is upon us, and as we venture more deeply into the fall season, the light wanes as I'm seeing the darkness approaching outside. And as the darkness comes, we search for a light to lead us through the darkness. God is the source of this light, and it is God who gives us both the light to lead us and the most precious peace from above that God offers for eternity, for the life and healing of this world. Thank you for being with us this evening. I wish you and yours God's peace as you venture into the darkness, emboldened with the courage that God, the source of light, is with us. Thank you and have a good evening.